At 9:26 p.m., a man called 911. He was screaming and crying. He did not sound like a tough police officer anymore. His voice had none of the control he was known for. His name was David Camm. He was a former Indiana State Trooper. He had just spent the evening playing basketball with friends. He expected to hear his wife and children inside the house. Instead, it was completely quiet. Too quiet. David walked into the dark garage. He looked toward the family's Ford Explorer. What he saw would change his life forever. His wife, Kim, was lying on the concrete floor in a pool of blood. Inside the SUV were his 7-year-old son, Bradley, and his 5-year-old daughter, Jill. Both had been shot. David panicked. He pulled Bradley from the vehicle and desperately tried to save him. But it was too late. His wife and both of his children were dead. Soon, police cars filled the driveway. But as investigators began piecing the case together, the grieving husband who had called 911 quickly became the focus of the investigation. To detectives, the case appeared straightforward. David was a former police officer. Investigators examined problems in his marriage. They also believed there was no convincing evidence of a forced entry. Before long, they began to suspect that David's emotional 911 call might not have been genuine. At the center of the prosecution's case was a small piece of physical evidence found on David's gray t-shirt. Evidence two sides would spend 13 years fighting over. The jury found David guilty, and he was convicted of murdering his wife and children. That conviction marked the beginning of a 13-year fight to clear his name. But while David sat behind bars, another piece of evidence remained in storage. It was a gray sweatshirt found at the crime scene near Kim's body. For years, its significance was not fully understood. Then investigators made a discovery. A name had been written inside the collar. That single discovery would eventually reshape the entire investigation and lead detectives in a completely different direction. But before DNA evidence reshaped the case, detectives were convinced they had the right man. To understand why, we have to go back to David Camm's life before that September night. In the fall of 2000, the Camm family lived in Georgetown, Indiana, a small southern Indiana community where violent crime was uncommon. From the outside, their life appeared ordinary. David Camm was a former Indiana State Police trooper. Athletic and competitive, he was well known in the community. His wife, Kim, devoted much of her time to raising their 2 children. Bradley was 7 years old. Jill was 5. Like countless other families, they followed the routines of work, school, and family life. Thursday, September 28, 2000, began like any other day. The children went to school, Kim stayed home, and that evening David left to play basketball with friends at a local church gym. That basketball game would later become one of the most closely examined parts of the entire case. Several people were on the court with David that night. They told investigators he was there throughout the game, making it a key part of his account of where he was during the time prosecutors believed the murders occurred. While David was playing basketball, Kim was at home with Bradley and Jill. No one knew those would be the family's final hours together. When the game ended, David drove home through the darkness. As he pulled into the driveway, nothing immediately seemed out of place. Moments later, everything changed. Inside the garage, Kim lay on the concrete floor. Bradley and Jill had been shot inside the family's Ford Explorer. In a panic, David called 911. On paper, he appeared to have witnesses who placed him somewhere else that evening. So how did a man with an apparent alibi become the prosecution's prime suspect? The answer begins with what investigators believed they found at the crime scene. Sirens cut through the night as police cars and ambulances rushed to the Camm home. Officers from across the area arrived within minutes. Inside the garage, they found a scene unlike anything most of them had ever seen. 3 victims, 1 family, a brutal crime. Detectives got to work right away. They photographed the scene, measured key areas, collected shell casings, and searched for anything that could explain what had happened. Almost immediately, their attention turned to David Camm. There were several reasons why. He was the one who found the bodies. He was a former Indiana State Police trooper who understood how crime scenes were investigated. Detectives also found no clear signs of forced entry. To them, the evidence pointed towards someone the family knew. Within days, David was arrested and charged with murdering his wife and children. At the center of the prosecution's case were 8 tiny bloodstains on David's gray t-shirt. To many people, those stains seemed easy to explain. David had pulled his son from the Ford Explorer and tried to save him. He had been surrounded by blood. But forensic experts saw those stains very differently. The prosecution's experts testified that the spots were gunshot-back spatter. They argued the blood could only have landed on David's shirt if he had been standing close to the victims when the shots were fired. The defense's experts strongly disagreed. They believed the stains were transfer marks, not backspatter. In their opinion, the blood got onto David's shirt when he reached into the SUV and came into contact with his family while trying to help them. Two groups of experienced experts, the same 8 bloodstains, two completely different conclusions, and David Camm's future depended on which one the jury believed. But investigators were looking at more than bloodstains. They also wanted to know why a father would kill his own family. As they dug deeper into David Camm's personal life, they discovered he had been unfaithful to his wife. Prosecutors believed they had found a motive. They argued David wanted a new life and that his family had become an obstacle standing in the way. David's lawyers strongly disagreed. They admitted that an affair could make someone a bad husband, but they argued it did not make him a man capable of murdering his wife and children. Then, investigators turned to the timeline. Everyone agreed that David had been playing basketball that evening. The question was whether he still had enough time to drive home, kill his family, and call 911. Prosecutors said he did. The defense said the timeline simply didn't work. Then there was another problem. The murder weapon was never found. Police searched the house, the neighborhood, and nearby ponds, but the gun seemed to have vanished. Prosecutors argued that killers often hide or dispose of weapons. The defense argued that without the gun, there was no direct physical evidence linking David to the shootings. The case was filled with questions. Yet one piece of evidence, already sitting in an evidence locker, had received almost no attention at all. The gray sweatshirt found near Kim's body, with a handwritten nickname stitched inside the collar. At the time, no one realized that small detail would eventually help change the course of the entire case. On October 1st, 2000, the handcuffs clicked shut. David Camm was charged with murdering his wife and 2 children. To many people, it looked like the case had already been solved. A former Indiana State Police trooper had been arrested just 3 days after his family was found dead. But charging someone is one thing. Convincing a jury is another. When David's first trial began, prosecutors presented a straightforward theory. They argued that David killed his family, left to play basketball, and later returned home to make the murders look like someone else's crime. For weeks, the courtroom worked through the same evidence investigators had built their case on. The bloodstains, the affair, the missing weapon, the timeline. Jurors sat through hours of forensic testimony as each side's expert walked through the same 8 stains, arriving at opposite conclusions. It was, in effect, the same argument the case had opened with, now tested in front of 12 people instead of a squad of detectives. Jurors heard testimony about David's affairs and the problems in his marriage. Prosecutors argued those details helped explain a possible motive. The defense strongly disagreed. They argued that being an unfaithful husband was not evidence of murder. They warned jurors not to confuse personal mistakes with proof of a violent crime. There were still major questions. The murder weapon had never been found. There were no eyewitnesses to the shootings. There was no confession. Much of the state's case depended on circumstantial evidence and on whether the jury accepted its interpretation of the bloodstains. If the jurors believed the prosecution's experts, David faced the rest of his life in prison. If they believed the defense, the state's case became much harder to prove. Soon 12 jurors would decide which version of the evidence they believed. Their verdict would change the course of the case, but it would not be the end of the story. Before the jury began its deliberations, the defense pointed to one piece of evidence they believed investigators had overlooked: the gray sweatshirt found at the crime scene. It didn't belong to David, Kim, or their children. Written inside the collar was a strange nickname: Backbone. Investigators didn't know who Backbone was or how the sweatshirt ended up in the garage. Prosecutors argued the sweatshirt had nothing to do with the murders. The defense argued it could have belonged to the real killer. At the time, no one could answer that question. In March 2002, after weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. Guilty. The judge sentenced David Camm to 195 years in prison. For prosecutors, it was the end of a successful murder case. For David, it was the beginning of a long fight to clear his name. Most people believed the case was over. It wasn't. From prison, David's lawyers appealed the conviction. As appeal is different from a new trial, the judges were not deciding whether David was innocent or guilty. Instead, they reviewed whether legal mistakes had affected the fairness of the trial. As they examined the record, one issue stood out. The prosecution had introduced extensive testimony about David's affairs and personal life. The appeals court would soon decide whether that evidence should ever have reached the jury. That decision would change the course of the case and send it back to court once again. In 2004, the case took a dramatic turn. The Indiana Court of Appeals ruled that David Camm had not received a fair trial. The judges said the jury had heard too much testimony about his affairs and personal life. They overturned his conviction and ordered a new trial. For David's defense team, it was a second chance. They also pushed for more testing on one piece of evidence that had remained a mystery from the very beginning: the gray sweatshirt found at the crime scene. This time, investigators ran DNA from the sweatshirt through the national database. The search came back with a name: Charles Boney. Boney had a long criminal history, including violent crimes against women. He had also recently been released from prison. When detectives questioned him, Boney denied killing the Camm family. He said he had never met them and denied being involved in the murders. But the DNA link to the sweatshirt raised new questions that investigators could no longer ignore. As detectives looked deeper into Boney's past, they noticed something unusual. In several of his earlier crimes, investigators said he had a disturbing habit. He removed the victim's shoes. That detail caught their attention. On the night of the murders, Camm's shoes had been removed and placed on top of the family's Ford Explorer. By itself, that did not prove who committed the murders, but combined with the DNA evidence, it forced investigators to take a much closer look at Charles Boney. For the first time since David Camm was arrested, the investigation was moving in a completely different direction. The defense argued that investigators had focused on David Camm for so long that they failed to fully investigate Charles Boney. Prosecutors disagreed. They argued that DNA on a sweatshirt did not prove Boney had committed the murders. Then investigators uncovered another important piece of evidence. They re-examined a palm print found on the family's Ford Explorer. This time it matched Charles Boney. The print was found on the vehicle near where Kim's shoes had been placed. Now investigators had more than DNA. They had evidence linking Boney to the crime scene. When detectives confronted him with the new evidence, Boney changed his story. He admitted the sweatshirt was his, but he denied killing the Camm family. Instead, Boney claimed he had met David Camm to sell him a gun. According to Boney, he carried the gun wrapped inside the gray sweatshirt. He said Kim arrived home while they were in the garage. Moments later, he claimed he heard an argument, gunshots, and a child screaming. Boney blamed the murders on David. His account offered one explanation for why his sweatshirt and palm print were connected to the crime scene. But investigators also found evidence that raised new questions about his story. Forensic testing found tiny carpet fibers on Boney's sweatshirt that were consistent with carpet from inside the Camm home. Investigators also found no evidence that David Camm and Charles Boney knew each other before the murders. The case had become far more complicated than anyone expected. In David's first trial, prosecutors argued he acted alone. Now, as the second trial approached, they presented a different theory. This time they argued that David Camm and Charles Boney worked together, with prosecutors alleging that David was the gunman. The defense challenged that theory. If Boney's DNA, sweatshirt and palm print connected him to the crime scene, they asked, why hadn't investigators focused on him from the beginning? Once again, the courtroom became a battle between competing forensic experts. The same bloodstains, revisited now under a new theory of the crime, with each side accusing the other of bending the evidence to fit a story that had already changed once. For a second time, 12 jurors would have to decide which version of the evidence they believed. In March 2006, David Camm's second trial came to an end. The jury returned to the courtroom and announced its verdict. Guilty. Once again, David Camm was convicted of murdering his wife and children and sent back to prison. Prosecutors believed they had finally secured a lasting conviction. David's lawyers disagreed. They filed another appeal, arguing that serious mistakes had once again kept David from receiving a fair trial. This time they focused on one of the prosecution's most damaging claims. During the second trial, prosecutors argued that David had sexually abused his 5-year-old daughter, Jill, and killed his family to keep that secret from coming out. The defense said there was no reliable medical evidence to support that accusation. In 2009, the Indiana Court of Appeals agreed that the allegation should not have been presented to the jury. The court ruled that the testimony had unfairly prejudiced the trial, overturned David's conviction, and ordered a third trial. Very few murder cases ever reach a third trial, but the biggest breakthrough was still to come. As both sides prepared to return to court, forensic science continued to improve. Investigators now had access to more advanced DNA testing, including touch DNA, which can recover tiny skin cells left behind after someone touches an object. Experts used that technology to examine key pieces of evidence collected from the crime scene. The new results raised even more questions about Charles Boney's account of what happened that night. And they would become some of the most important evidence presented at David Camm's third trial. By the summer of 2013, David Camm had spent 13 years fighting to clear his name. He had been convicted twice. Both convictions had been overturned. Now, a third jury was about to hear the case. This trial felt different. The arguments were no longer centered only on the bloodstains found on David's shirt. New DNA evidence had become one of the most important parts of the case. One of the defense's key witnesses was DNA expert Dr. Richard Eikelenboom. He testified about the results of advanced DNA testing on evidence collected from the crime scene. Charles Boney had long denied attacking the Camm family, but the new DNA evidence raised serious questions about his account. Boney's DNA was found on Kimberly Camm's underwear. It was also found on the sleeve of her shirt. Investigators also recovered Boney's DNA from beneath one of Kimberly's fingernails. Another DNA sample linked Boney to the front of 5-year-old Jill's shirt. The defense argued that these findings placed Boney in direct contact with the victims and were difficult to reconcile with his version of events. Then Charles Boney took the witness stand. He admitted the gray sweatshirt belonged to him, but he continued to deny killing the Camm family. Instead, he repeated his claim that David Camm had arranged to buy a gun from him. According to Boney, he brought the gun wrapped inside the gray sweatshirt. He claimed Kim arrived home while they were in the garage. Moments later, he said, David suddenly shot his family, forcing him to flee. The defense challenged that story. Investigators found no evidence that David Camm and Charles Boney had ever known each other before the murders. They uncovered no phone records, letters, or other evidence connecting the two men. In closing arguments, the defense told jurors that investigators had focused on David from the beginning and failed to fully follow the evidence wherever it led. Now, after 3 trials and more than a decade of legal battles, everything came down to one final verdict. Think about everything the jury had just heard. The gray sweatshirt, the DNA evidence, the nickname Backbone written inside the collar, the palm print on the family's Ford Explorer. Together, those pieces of evidence pointed investigators toward Charles Boney. The defense argued they had been there for years, yet the investigation stayed focused on David Camm. As the trial drew to a close, prosecutors presented another argument. For years they had maintained that David acted alone. Now they told jurors that even if Charles Boney had fired the shots, David could still be guilty if he had helped plan or carry out the murders. The defense challenged that theory. They argued the state had changed its explanation of the crime because the evidence no longer fit its original case. They also reminded jurors that investigators had found no evidence showing David Camm and Charles Boney knew each other before the murders. The case was finally in the jury's hands. After 2 months of testimony, the lawyers waited. The victims' families waited. David Camm waited. On October 24, 2013, the courtroom fell silent as the jury returned. The verdict was read. Not guilty on all counts. After spending 13 years in prison, David Camm walked out of the courthouse a free man. But the story did not end there. Charles Boney had already been tried separately and was serving a 225-year prison sentence for the murders and other crimes. Even after David's acquittal, Boney continued to insist that David had been involved. No court accepted that claim, and investigators found no independent evidence that the two men knew each other before the murders. David regained his freedom, but the cost was impossible to measure. He had lost his wife. He had lost his 7-year-old son, Bradley. He had lost his 5-year-old daughter, Jill. And he had lost 13 years of his own life behind bars. Years later, David reached a settlement with state officials over his wrongful imprisonment, but no amount of money could erase what had happened. Today, the David Camm case is widely studied by lawyers, investigators, and forensic experts. It remains a powerful reminder of how important it is to keep testing evidence, question assumptions, and follow the facts wherever they lead. In the end, the grey sweatshirt became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case, not because it answered every question, but because it forced investigators and the justice system to ask the right ones. And that changed everything.